Well, Michael Garten, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Austin. Long-time viewer and appreciator of your content and appreciator of many of the guests you've had on. So this is a real treat to be joining you today.
Well, I've been looking forward to this. It was a little bit of a funny backstory to it in that I had just bought your book when you reached out to me and you're like, hey, I wrote this book. You might like it. It's like, I
Yeah.
just read it. And I did. And it was really good. And so you've recently written on early icon veneration or early image veneration, early images in
Yeah.
Christianity. And the link for that book will be in the description. But even though it's maybe a bit cliche to start with definitions, I do think it's important. And I think I want to start with this idea of what is veneration as we jump into this topic, because I think the way that you're using it in this book is particularly interesting because it might be different than what some people have in mind when they hear veneration. They might think like bowing, kissing, candles, not kissing candles, lighting candles, all of those types of things. I'll let you answer what you think it is, but just so we're all on the same page getting into this, when we talk about veneration today, what are we talking about?
So in my book, Early Icons, Christian Image Veneration before 325 AD, I define veneration as any act or gesture which acknowledges the honorable status of a person or thing. And I think this is a good definition because obviously just listing specific acts of veneration, specific modes of veneration, it doesn't really work as a way of giving a definition for something, strictly speaking. And if you say veneration is bowing and kissing, well, then you have to deal with the fact that those are physically very different actions. And so the common element between them, which you have to find in order to have a definition, I would say, is that the gesture is intended to acknowledge someone or something's honorable status. And there's other actions which clearly count as veneration and are recognized as such by people in late antiquity, like late Roman Empire era, early Byzantine Empire era, as well as these being recognized by Protestant apologists who talk on this issue. Things such as processing with an image, carrying an image in procession, exalting or lifting it up high, um, even gazing with reverence upon an image. It's pretty obvious that both ancient people in the early Christian era, as well as modern people of various confessional backgrounds, can kind of recognize that, like, yeah, reverence is being paid to an image when you do stuff like that. Um, and I think it's important also to realize that several of the examples of veneration that get deliberated about in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the Council of Second Nicaea, which is the kind of touch point of controversy for icon veneration, since it dogmatizes the practice and basically expresses it as essential to Christian life. Several of the examples of veneration that are deliberated about and discussed um, in the proceedings of Second Nicaea are not bowing and kissing. So, one of the texts that they consider is one which discusses the placement of crowns upon images, or placing candles and lamps in front of images, even placing an image on a holy surface, such as a domestic altar. And they even talk about the in the documents that are read in that council, they even discuss approaching an image in order to receive healing from it as basically a mode of veneration. So, the common thread, I think, in all these examples is the fact that all of them involve an acknowledgement on the person who's coming to this image of its honorable status. And so, because that seems to be the common thread, the common definition, the essence of veneration, that's kind of what I'm looking for evidence of in the pre Nicene church, both physical evidence in the form of surviving paintings in particular, and of course also written evidence from pre Nicene Christian texts. And I will also mention that I think that there are some fairly easy ways to differentiate veneration and worship. We all know that there's a different attitude of reverence involved between honoring your father and your mother, as we're instructed in the commandments. That's very different from worshiping God. There's obviously an internal difference in terms of the kind of reverence that one has internally. And I would also say that worship can be differentiated from veneration because the actions and attitudes of worship can include the act of sacrifice, offering a sacrifice to someone or something. In doing such, in presenting a sacrifice, a welcoming gift, to use the terminology of one of your previous podcast guests and authors, in presenting a sacrifice, one is acknowledging the divine status of the one to whom the sacrifice is being presented, that thing or that person is deity. And so that's a kind of good dividing line that helps to show that there are some acts of honor which can be given without treating someone or something as a god, and then there are some acts of honor which cannot be done without treating someone or something as a god. So veneration and worship, I think, can be distinguished fairly effectively in that manner.
That's helpful. So I think there's going to be another distinction here that's going to be helpful, but to preface it a little bit, the reason these are worth looking at, and you mentioned, is we can't like go back in a time machine to the kind of apostolic church. We can't go back to pre-Nicaea to see what's happening. So we have to look at the evidence and say, okay, how were they treating these things, both written and kind of in the material evidence, and does that look like something that we would call veneration? We can't see it with a video camera, but we can kind of get hints at this. And one way is through kind of having this definition of what is veneration, see if we have any indication that people are doing that. But then I think maybe even a step further back from that is this concept you introduced called an intrinsically honorable image. I'll let you explain what that is. But as far as I see it in the argument, it seems like it's doing some weight of, well, if we have these images that are intrinsically honorable, we can probably infer that they are being reverenced in a certain way that we might be able to call veneration, even if we can't kind of have video camera footage of someone kissing, bowing, lighting candles, any of these things, or just kind of more or less obvious forms of veneration, like gazing intently upon it, that just this image itself being honorable can point towards, maybe how people would relate to it. But intrinsically honorable image, what exactly is that?
Yeah, this idea of the intrinsically honorable image, it came to me because one thing I noticed certain scholars of early Christian material culture doing, scholars such as Thomas Matthews, Robin Jensen, and Catherine Marzingill, was that they said that the very existence of a portrait image among early Christians, a portrait of Christ or a saint, effectively implies that veneration occurred. And I was a little bit, caught by this. At first it sounds kind of weird because I can imagine a modern Protestant person placing a portrait of Christ on their desk, even something that Orthodox would recognize as an icon, and not venerating it. But the issue is that when you think about it, if we have lots of evidence that the surrounding Roman culture and cultures that kind of bordered Rome, if we have lots of evidence that the surrounding Roman culture venerated portraits, so much evidence that it becomes almost part of the definition of a portrait, that it's to be venerated, then it does start to kind of make sense to infer from the existence of a portrait that veneration was occurring. And so that's really the idea of an intrinsically honorable image. It's that if you run across evidence that someone had an image, whether that's archaeological evidence or written evidence, and it's a well-known type of image, so much well-known that gestures of honor can be kind of seen as built into the culturally set definition of what that image was for that culture, then it does seem reasonable to infer, when you uncover this new instance of that image that's of a recognizable kind, a venerated kind, it does seem reasonable to infer that the image you just uncovered in the textual or the written record was venerated. That such an image was venerated is likely at face value, I would say, even if we don't have any overt evidence of a gesture in this specific case, simply because of the kind of image it is. And so that's an intrinsically honorable image. And in this book, I mainly focus on three kinds: battle standards, signet ring seals, and then ceremonial cup images. I will be delving more into the question of portrait images in the sequel volume, though readers of early icons know that I do talk about veneration of a pre Nicene portrait type image in the final chapter. And I'll mention this, that the idea of an intrinsically honorable image, it's not putting forward like a deductive inference. It's not saying that like the existence of an image of this kind logically guarantees that veneration occurred. It's a more probabilistic claim. It's a more inference to the best explanation kind of an argument that basically just says, well, if we know that Christians were using this pre existing type that was already present in the culture, and if we also have other evidence that Christians adopted some of the ceremonial practices of the Roman world, which we do, then it does seem reasonable at face value. If you don't have any contrary evidence, if you don't have any evidence that this image was not venerated, well, then you have better reason to think that it was venerated than that it wasn't. Um, it's not that bold of a claim. It's not, again, it's not claiming 100% certainty from the mere existence of the image. It's more asking for, the person who's inquiring about this to just decide which seems more likely, that this venerated type of image was venerated or that this venerated type of image wasn't.
That makes sense. And, correct me if I'm wrong, or let me kind of play with an analogy here, rather. And this comes from like my upbringing. So I went to a Christian school when I was a kid, and they had, like a public school, you had to pledge allegiance to the flag, right? So there's a flag up in the top of the classroom, like most schools had. But in our school, there was also a Christian flag next to it. Now, we also did a pledge allegiance to the Christian flag, and it was, very mirrored. We were taking something from the secular culture, and we were Christianizing it. But let's imagine that we're 1,000 years in the future, and we don't have that video camera footage to see that the kids stood up in class and they did the same thing.
Yeah.
They had a pledge. But having those two flags next to each other, using that kind of category of a thing, like a flag in a classroom, but having a Christian version, would give us reason to think that they were probably doing a pledge to this as well, unless we had reason to think otherwise. Is that like a fair analogy of what's going on here with using a similar type of imagery in a Christian mode?
Absolutely. Like that's exactly the kind of inference that I'm making. And I think that examples like that, one of my godsons, who I'm sure will watch this, will find that example amusing, because he and I discussed that very idea of the Christian flag being used by evangelicals, and then the kinds of questions that it raises, because it does seem a little bit difficult to say that, one can legitimately show veneration to a state image, but then that one cannot legitimately show veneration to an image of the kingdom of that's related to the kingdom of God. But yes, I do think that that kind of example captures the point quite nicely. Um, and I'll use another example. So obviously, Orthodox Christians reject idolatry and don't. We at least claim that the images we use are not idols and that we do not worship them. But one thing is for sure is that if you were to, as you were doing an archaeological dig in the Egyptian desert, if you were to come across something that was quite clearly an idol in a domestic space, it doesn't seem reasonable to kind of sit there and kind of shrug about the question of how it was used. It seems very straightforward that if it's of the recognizable kind idol, then it was sacrificed to. Then offerings of incense, probably, as well as food, were probably placed in front of it in order to feed the spirit that was believed to dwell within the idol, and so forth. Um, and so I think cases like that, they do help to show that there are very reasonable ways to make inferences from the presence of an object in archaeology to how it was likely used, and similar things in written records as well. So yeah.
Right, that totally makes sense. And so I think that can lead us nicely into the first example that you use in your book, or the first category of image, and that is of the cross. And so you talk about the cross in comparison, or you talk about the cross as a standard. We see some writers using that language, and you compare that to Roman standards. A couple of things to kind of break down here. So first, people might not be familiar with like what the Roman standards are, so the comparison might just fly over their heads. So let's make sure we touch on what that is. And why is it significant that we're talking about the cross as a standard? Does this put us in the category of something like, okay, we've got an intrinsically honorable image here?
Yeah, and so as far as what standards were, it is accurate to say that they are a kind of state symbol analogous to the flags that we have today. But I think just simply saying like, oh, they're flags, they're flags. I think that might be selling them short a little bit, because they truly were objects of cult. They were very definitely um, uh, very definitely and in a very organized manner, they were either venerated or worshipped, depending on which standard you're talking about. They were seen as symbols of power that the Romans would bring into battle with them, that would basically protect them and afford them victory over their adversaries. Um, I would say that typical types of standards would be the Aquila standard, which had a golden eagle that was seen as perhaps an something like an idol or something like an icon, depending on exactly maybe which emperor you're under, or which segment of Roman history you're in. But an image of Zeus, because that's one of his kind of uh, one of his characteristic symbols is the eagle. You also had vexillas, which looked a lot more like flags. They were kind of like banners that um, had I think cloth hanging from them with images on them. And then the third kind and this is the kind that I think is the most important to consider for Christianity, is the trophy standards, or tropeum. And um, we have numerous examples in, with the trophy standards. These were not understood as images of the gods or guardian spirits, as the vexillas and the aquillas sometimes were, but rather were representations of the triumph of an emperor or a conqueror of some sort. They were composed out of by taking like a vertical pole and then attaching the armor of a defeated enemy to it, like the chest plate typically. Uh, Oftentimes shields, swords, and helmets as well, to give the appearance of basically a human mounted on a pole, but of course supported by a horizontal beam. And the fact that this is the shape of the cross was not lost on early Christian apologists of the second and early third century, such as St. Justin Martyr and Minucius Felix and Tertullian, though there's others that make comments about the cross and the standards resembling each other as well. Um, these apologists effectively they accuse the Romans of unwittingly venerating the cross by means of their acts of ceremonial reverence to these battle standards. And they talk about them being carried in processions, which is also well documented in Roman art. There's also a practice of placing crowns upon battle standards as well. You see surviving images, and I have one in early icons of a trophy having a crown of leaves placed upon it. So it's really interesting that these same apologists, they're looking at what appears to be a Roman inadvertent veneration of the cross, which they see as a symbol of cosmic power by which Christ orders the world and gives it its hierarchical structure and allows things to exist in community together under that hierarchy. And then they start saying things that seem to indicate that they have images of the cross of their own, which they call standards. So in Tertullian, in his writings, he introduces this contrast between the Roman military cult. He describes it as the camp of darkness that performs the human sacrament, of emperor worship, and he describes the standard of the devil as belonging to the Romans. This he contrasts with the Christian assembly, the church, which he calls the camp of light. He says that we have the divine sacrament, referring to the Eucharist, and he says that we have the standard of Christ. Elsewhere, Tertullian speaks about how Christians, um, elsewhere he speaks about how Christians consecrate images of the cross. He calls the cross the sign of wood. And he says that one of the things uh, that he accepts from the pagans in terms of an accusation against Christianity is that we are a priesthood of the cross. So you see this affirmation of Christians having crosses, viewing them as the Christianized version of, or the true version of, these Roman standards, a very characteristically honored image. And you also see references to actual gestures being done. On top of the mere presence of the intrinsically honorable image, you have Tertullian speaking as though there's some kind of a gesture being done to the image of the cross when he says that we are a priesthood of the cross and that it's a consecrated object, which means that it was viewed as holy. And you can find the description of the cross as standard even further back when you look in St. Ignatius of Antioch himself. So late 1st or early 2nd century. He speaks of how Christ has raised up a standard for all ages to all of his holy and faithful followers in the one body of the church. And this matches in a number of remarkable ways the way that trophy standards were treated in the Roman world. Both the tendency to put them in an elevated place of honor in order to show them respect, as well as the idea of them being presented in a formal ceremonial way for veneration by a victorious army. This is something that you see in the Aeneid when Aeneas himself makes a trophy after a victory. So this language of the standard being raised up for all ages to all of his holy and faithful followers in the one body of the church, that last phrase, in the one body of the church, clarifies that this does seem to be a literal object. For St. Ignatius, the church is a very concrete thing. It's the local Eucharistic gathering under the bishop. So we have both descriptions of images of the cross as trophy or as standard, and we have these phrases like consecrate, priesthood of the cross, raise up for all ages, present to all of his holy and faithful followers, which seem to also be indicating that there are these acts of veneration being done. And in this way, Christians were they were not really so much focused on the wood itself as the fact that Christ's victory over sin and death had to be celebrated. It had to be proclaimed with more intensity than the Romans proclaimed the earthly victories of their emperors. And so that seems to be kind of what's behind this understanding of the cross as standard.
That's helpful. I imagine one of the pushbacks or concerns that people might have is that they might say, like, but isn't the cross just like it's a symbol, right? And when they talk about, like, we raise up the cross or a priest of the cross, what makes us think that we're talking about, like, actual crosses and not just, using metaphorical language? Is it the comparison to the Roman standard here that is kind of doing some of that work of telling us that, while it might have symbolic overtones, we're also talking about, like, reverencing actual crosses? Is that the key, the standard language?
Well, I would say that with both Tertullian and Saint Ignatius and Saint Justin Martyr, you do have reason beyond the language of standard for thinking that there are actual physical images of the cross in view. And so when Tertullian speaks of the cross as consecrated, he chides and makes fun of the pagans for consecrating incomplete crosses made of a single piece of vertical wood. Whereas what he says is that the Christians, he says, others consecrate complete in shape. So referring to both pieces of wood. The language of sign of wood also does seem to point to something very much physical and actually in front of you. With Saint Ignatius, the the multiple layers of description that match the treatment of a trophy, I think, are quite significant. But then I would also just point out that when he says that the standard is lifted up in the one body of the church, um, the most straightforward way of reading this is that, given what he means by church, that he's talking about something that concretely occurs in the Christian gathering. There's also in Saint Justin Martyr, in addition to making comparisons between the cross and trophies, and in addition to St. Justin describing the cross of Christ as the greatest symbol of his power and rule, St. Justin also has a very cryptic and interesting passage where he speaks about what seems to be an origin of the practice of making images of the cross in the life of Christ and the actions of Christ himself. He says that as a carpenter, Christ made plows and yokes. And the word he uses for yokes is actually cross beams. It's that would be a broader way of understanding that Greek word. St. Justin already elsewhere compares plows to the form of the cross. There's something that he's working off of here when he says this. And St. Justin says that in making plows and yokes, Christ was teaching men the symbols of righteousness and an act of life. Now, given that he's already said that the cross is the greatest symbol of his power and rule, there does seem to be an indication here that we're talking about the actual formation of images which had a symbolic function. Images of the cross which symbolized and therefore connected you to the original cross of Christ and its power. So while I do think that the mere description of the cross as standard is significant in and of itself and may carry some significant weight in showing that there were actual depictions, I think that it's also this additional written evidence, as well as quite a bit of archaeological evidence that we have of the presence of images of the cross in the pre-Nicene era. People that are interested in that, I recommend very, very highly the book "The Cross Before Constantine" by the scholar Bruce Longenecker. So, yeah.
Yeah, Longenecker's done a couple. I remember reading one of his, I think it was him. Did he do In Stone and Story? I don't know if you know. I had to read that for one of my classes, and it was a great book to kind of talk about like the material culture, which I'm going to refrain from falling rabbit holes here, but I do think I can never remember if it's rabbit trails or rabbit holes. Anyway, speaking of doing precisely the thing I said I wasn't going to do, but it is really important in these conversations that I think oftentimes because of the kind of the way we're formed in learning theology, we only look at written evidence, but balancing written and material evidence, especially for something that is material, being images, is really important. And I think we can have blind spots when we only look at one or the other. And so I appreciate the way that you've done that today and the way that you do that in your book. I wanted to ask kind of one final follow-up on the idea of crosses before we turn to some of the other forms of images. And that is, and this is kind of speculative, but when I think of veneration today, people generally think of like Catholics and Orthodox as far as like venerating images. But if I look at like any Protestant church, or at least any classic Protestant church, they probably have a cross up high somewhere, and maybe even at certain liturgical seasons, they'll drape like different cloth over it, right? Would you consider that, given the definition of veneration we have so far and the way we've talked about the cross, would you consider that veneration?
I would, yeah. And I actually remember as a high school student, I briefly attended an evangelical church. I was raised in kind of a more, I would say, a progressive United Methodist type of a background, but I briefly attended an evangelical church in high school, and it was very interesting. It's interesting to look back on it now, but during Holy Week, which they actually had like kind of like a Holy Week celebration, they did drape like cloth over the cross. They brought a cross to the front of their church. They draped cloth over it, and then they had people write down their sins and fold them up and place them under the cross. And now that I'm looking back on it, it does strike me there is actually more image veneration um, among Protestants than it appears at first glance. There's acts like that which clearly are interacting with the prototype, the actual cross of Christ, and then ultimately Christ Himself by means of an interaction with the image, and where the image is being treated as a point from which you can address supplication to God. So I do actually think that actions like that are veneration. My goal in early icons, it's not to show that the pre-Nicene Christians venerated images in a way that Protestants would be uncomfortable with. It's just to show that there was veneration. And so, if, as it turns out, the modes of veneration that were done in the pre-Nicene Church are things that Protestants are actually quite comfortable with, all the better. That actually, I mean, that's kind of helpful in a way. But in doing so, it would be showing that the objection to the Second Council of Nicaea, which says there's literally no precedent for image veneration in the early church, every early Christian was aniconic, no gesture veneration, maybe the late 7th century or maybe the late 6th century, it would be showing that those kinds of claims are incorrect. So that's more the goal, is to defend the claim, defend the Second Council of Nicaea and Orthodox and Catholic claims about it against the accusation that there's zero precedent for any kind of gesture of honor in the pre-Nicene Church. Yeah.
That makes sense, and I think it's good for people to remember that, or at least to entertain the idea. I won't say remember, but it's worth entertaining the idea that veneration might not solely be all the category of things you're uncomfortable with, while not including the category of things that you are comfortable with. I know the example you gave of like putting sins at the cross is something that I did in my evangelical church growing up too, and there's definitely there's a reason we're doing it at a cross there, right? We're not just putting them in a bucket. It's because there is some kind of honor in this image of the cross. And so, whatever people will do with that, I think it is helpful to think, well, maybe veneration's a bit broader than I thought. And so I think that's a good example there. I want to pivot a little bit to signet rings and their connection with baptism. I'll just kind of put my cards on the table. I enjoyed all the book. This chapter was the most interesting to me personally. I just didn't have the background with this specifically, so I found it surprising and intriguing. But walk us through this a little bit. So the role of signet rings in kind of Greco-Roman society, and then how Christians are co-opting those to get us to something like veneration. What's going on here?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, a signet ring's function in the ancient world was to seal documents or property, extending your dominion over something, basically, by using the ring to make a stamp, which was kind of unique to your family or to your office if you were, a Roman government official. Although, I mean, frankly, if you even look in far back in the Bible to Genesis, you see this same idea of officials being given the royal ring. Joseph, he receives Pharaoh's ring as he's being elevated to basically this kind of equality with Pharaoh. And as he passes through the streets, the people, they bow before him. Some connection between the rings and status. And I think that's the reason why signet rings had this function of extending your dominion, is because they were seen as kind of little vessels of status. They almost contained like honor within them, authority, almost like a kind of contained inside them. And that's partly because of the images or inscriptions that were on them. The images on them typically showed one of the sources of honor and authority for your household or your empire, as the case may be. So they tended to have images of things like ancestors, military leaders and heroes, philosophers, emperors, or deities. They tended not to have images of things that were just like random stuff. Even sometimes when they do have images of random stuff, though, Clement of Alexandria speaks about how we're not supposed to wear images, signet ring images of swords and bows and drinking cups, Even those kinds of images, though, do seem to have a kind of cultic significance and potentially connection with deities. Ares, Diana, Dionysius come to mind when you think of those objects. So there are some episodes from Roman literature which show that signet images were interacted with, that they afforded a kind of connection to the prototype that was depicted on the ring. Ovid talks about how his friends who are speaking of him and mourning his exile, they can look at his ring, image on his ring, and kind of mourn for him while looking at it. Cicero talks about how the seal image of an ancestor is supposed to evoke piety, turn you away from mutinous or rebellious actions. And this makes sense in light of what's been said, but it will also surprise people that these rings were also shown gestures of reverence. So, with Pliny the Elder, for instance, who's an associate of the Roman emperors, he talks about a practice of ceremonially handling signet rings that Roman householders did. They treated ring images as basically like little sacred images and placed them inside of boxes, which could be called sanctuaries, or at least described as such. So this category of ceremonial handling is, I think, a really interesting one, because, and it's really important because, to bring in another American flag illustration, we're all kind of familiar with the practice of like having a color guard, which, if you think about it, really is a way of honoring the flag. If access to the flag is restricted in ceremonial contexts, it's only kind of given from above, like some higher authority in the army. You don't kind of like self-appoint yourself to carry the flag. It's entrusted to a specific person or group of that has honor, and there are these protocols about how it's supposed to be handled. Speaking as an Eagle Scout from back when the Boy Scouts were, shall we say, a little bit different, I definitely remember being taught like there's a specific way to hold the flag. There's a specific like attitude with which you're supposed to carry it. You can't let it like kind of touch the ground and so forth. So this description of how the flag is handled by a color guard could just as easily, though, be applied to things like the Roman imperial signet. In the case of the imperial signet, there were specific agents who were appointed by the emperor to carry his golden signet and to basically exercise his authority throughout the empire. The permission to carry this ring could only be given by the emperor, and the ring couldn't just be passed off to someone else. It was kind of an official office. Now, looking at the Christian side of things, we have testimony of Christians specifically having signet rings in both Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian, and they both say very similar things. They look at the parable of the prodigal son, and they note the gift of the ring to the son as basically signifying inheritance in the context of baptism. They also have things to say about the robe and the shoes as well, but that's another thing to discuss for another time. The Christian signet ring is not something in this context that you get for yourself. It has to be given to you from Christ through the church. It's given in baptism specifically to Christians, and it's to be handled properly. Tertullian even speaks, when he describes the ring in the parable of the prodigal son as the sign and seal of baptism, he then later on says that you don't actually receive your signet until you're baptized, at which point, or until the time of baptism, at which point you use it in order to seal your profession of faith. In other words, you make an actual stamp on a profession of faith, like basically probably Tertullian speaks of the Christian rule of faith, the kind of what later blossomed into the creed. So he has something like that in mind. You place your seal upon it using this new baptismal signet. And if you think about it, this really tracks very precisely with the ceremonial handling we noted in the case of the imperial signet. It's all the same stuff. It has to be given from above. It's entrusted to someone like a special appointed person. It's reserved or restricted prior to it actually being given. And then also, you even get this sense that there are protocols for how it's to be handled based on things that Clement says about the ring as well. Now, since it is the case that this ceremonial handling of the imperial signet was veneration. And since you see the same thing being done in this Christian context, you see the baptismal signet, the golden ring, as Clement says, since you see it being treated in the same manner, it seems there is this common thread of ceremonial handling, of veneration by reverent treatment of an object, an image specifically, common between the case of the flag today, the Roman imperial signet, and then the Christian baptismal signet, which is modeled after it. This is so much the case that the scholar of early Christian material culture, Margaret A. Mitchell, in her article, The Poetics and Politics of Christian Baptism, she notes that Clement accords to Jesus the imperial prerogative of granting the right to wear a gold ring, which she notes, again, was restricted to imperial legates, had to be given from above. So I think when you take all of these considerations into account, it is very interesting to see this reverence with which these seal images were being treated. It seems to track with what we mean by honor, what we mean by veneration. There's another direction we could take this in as well, in terms of considering the apotropaic significance of signet rings too,
What does
because
that
there
mean?
was yes. So apotropaic basically means spiritually protective, spiritually protective. Um, and a lot of the time, people will wear crosses on their necks as a way basically of asking God for protection by means of the act of wearing it. Um, and Obviously, every culture has some kind of apotropaic image of its own. I mean, when I think about like very kind of like low tier American culture, I think of like Lucky Rabbit's feet and stuff like that. There's Everyone kind of has stuff like that. Um, but it's interesting that in the Roman context, it was a very, very, very common view to see rings as affording this kind of spiritual protection. There's lots of written references to it. Um, and then when we look at the actual kinds of symbols that Clement of Alexandria instructs to place on signet rings, uh, they do have a lot of connection to sources of power and protection. The 6 seals that he instructs to place on signet rings are the dove, the fish, the anchor, the ship scudding before the wind, the musical lyre, and the fisherman. Now, at first glance, those images just sound kind of like they were like a jumble of images taken from non idolatrous, neutral sounding kind of stuff from the Roman world. But as it turns out, these actually are all symbols of Christ, the Holy Spirit, or the cross. And as scholars such as Margaret Mitchell herself, as well as Robert Button out of the University of Exeter, as they note, it's plausible that these rings and the images on them were seen as affording spiritual protection. It's very common also in the pre-Nicene church in general just to speak of the cross as protecting us. The sign of the cross was a common gesture. And so, in light of this, in light of the known use of these rings, as well as the kinds of symbols on them and their close connection to protection, including in the writings of Clement himself, um, it does make a lot of sense to see Clement's signets and Tertullian signets as the kinds of objects, the kinds of images that one would wear in order to receive protection from what is depicted. And if you unpack that idea of receiving protection from what is depicted by means of wearing the image, you are either at the idea of praying through an image already, or you're inches away from it. So it seems kind of like once we've started saying, I'm going to wear this image in order to be protected by what it signifies, you can't kind of force what it signifies to protect you. It seems like there's an element of request or supplication going on that's being addressed by means of the act of wearing the image. So, in those ways, I would say it makes a lot of sense to see not just a spiritually protective, but even a devotional use of these kinds of images. The fact that we then have some surviving Christian seal rings, such as the one on the cover of my book, that display the act of prayer to Christ I think that that's extremely spiritually significant. It seems to point to the fact that Christians saw their rings and the images on them as affording the same kind of connection to the prototype that you would see in the Roman context.
That's super helpful. And like I said, a really fascinating part of the book and just an element of Roman culture that I wasn't familiar with, nor Christian culture that I was familiar with, the idea of actual kind of baptismal signet rings. I'm used to kind of talking about sacraments as signs and seals, but to take that one step further and use a sacrament like baptism, or accompany a sacrament like baptism with an actual seal, is really interesting, and just a clever practice. So kudos, I suppose, to the early church for that. I want to ask some high level questions towards the end here, but before we do that, I want to recognize we're not going to have time to go through kind of all the images that you talk about in your book. I think we've gotten to do a nice deep dive on crosses and signet rings here, but I want to give you just a quick chance at a kind of more overview level of what kind of other images are floating around in the pre-Nicene era, or at least what kind of other intrinsically honorable images do we have?
Yeah, and I think the main thing that I would want to point people to that they'll find particularly interesting is part three of the book goes from the written evidence considered in part two to surviving paintings. And what I argue is that three categories of surviving pre Nicene images that we have were likely given a devotional use. They were used in the context of prayer, and prayers were addressed to the one who is depicted, in some cases at least, by means of the image, by means of interaction with it. So in the first of those chapters, I look at images of orants, praying figures typically with their arms outstretched in prayer, and I make a number of arguments based on the formal qualities of these images, their context in the catacombs, as well as comparanda, similar images, uh, the use of which we know um, of orants in the broader Roman culture and surrounding cultures. I make arguments based on those kinds of considerations that the best explanation of these images is that they were used for devotional purposes, that prayer was addressed to the one who is depicted in some cases, and in other cases with these orant images, that they were meant to kind of cue or trigger prayer to Christ as the Good Shepherd, who would be depicted as the object of their prayer. And so a number of scholars of early Christian art, such as Dr. Robin Jensen and Norbert Zimmermann, Alan Faber, their views on this basically lend themselves to this devotional use of these images. Similar thing can be said about the image of Christ as the Good Shepherd. There are a number of arguments that can be given and a number of testimonies of scholars that can be brought forward to basically argue that the image of Christ as Good Shepherd, both in the arcosolia, the vaults, kind of semi-vaults of the catacombs, as well as the image of Christ as Good Shepherd above the baptismal font at the Dura Europos Church, that these portrayals were used for devotional purposes, that Christ was addressed in prayer through these images, that people would pledge themselves to Christ through these images, that they provided a devotional focal point while they were doing the act of offering themselves to God in baptism, because baptism is actually an act of worship to God. Um, and so the last category of image that I treat is there is a pre-Nicene image of Christ and the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, in the catacombs of Priscilla, that has an aspect of portraiture to it. And when art scholars speak of portraiture, this is something I didn't get at first when I was reading these people, but when they speak of portraiture, they're talking in a lot of cases about like outward facing faces of depicted persons. And it's very common to see portraiture as I mentioned earlier when talking about scholars such as Thomas Matthews, Catherine Marzingill, and Robin Jensen. It's very common to see portraiture as inviting interaction from the viewer, inviting you to address the person who's depicted, speak to them, um, is giving you this sense of genuine connection to the one who is depicted by means of their image, evoking emotions that are related to that, and then also as being able to address that person in prayer if it's God or one of the saints. And so there's a number of arguments that I give that that particular image was an interactive one and that it was one through which people could address Christ, who's facing outward towards the viewer, being presented by his mother, address Christ in prayer. So that part of the book, I think people will really enjoy. There's a lot of arguments based on architecture, the known use of certain kinds of images, lots of quotes from scholars that support that these pre-Nicene images were venerated.
That's really helpful. And it takes us back to that idea of, again, if we're using a type of image in a location that's kind of heightened, if you will, we
Yeah,
can't like deductively prove that there were people venerating it, but it seems like it's set up for veneration. Is that fair to say?
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. So I want to touch a little bit before we end on the idea of like what's going on when we hear certain early Christian writers seeming to talk negatively about images. Because I think if people, just if this episode was the only exposure people had to early Christian approaches to art, they would think like, wow, like they were all about it. But it does seem like there are some like kind of countervailing testimony of Christians speaking negatively about art. And the question generally seems to be, are they saying that all images are bad, all cultic uses of images are bad, or that only like pagan uses of images are bad? How would you, so first of all, would you take the idea that there's some testimony that seems to point towards not liking some aspects of imagery, and then how do you interpret that?
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate you bringing this up. I do. There are a couple of points where I briefly addressed this in early icons. I do a little bit of in-depth explanation for related to Clement and his views of art for this. I do a little bit of it with Origen. I have a brief footnote about Tertullian. But there are numerous early Christian authors who express an invective, an attack on images. And that's one of the characteristic features of the writings of the Christian apologists of the second century and many of the bishops as well of the second and early third centuries, such as St. Irenaeus. There is an invective against images, and this just raises the question of what are these images that they're speaking of? Now, in some cases, you can't actually tell exactly based on the context and based on the words that are used. You can't actually tell exactly which kinds of images they're talking about. But in a lot of cases, you actually can tell pretty clearly what the image in view is or what the image type in view is. And so, to give an example, Clement of Alexandria, he has this quote where he says that works of art then cannot be sacred or divine. This is sometimes put forward as a reason for thinking that Clement rejected icon veneration. Now, I actually appreciate this use of the quote in a certain sense because it does seem to be acknowledging that based on how an image is described, you can make inferences about whether it was venerated. So kudos to those who use this quote in that manner. However, in context, what's meant by sacred and divine is actually being a living, breathing God. And when you look at the actual specific things that Clement says, he speaks about immediately before in the preceding like 5 or 6 sentences before his phrase "works of art then cannot be sacred or divine." He speaks of how it is absurd for man, who is the creation of God, to make God, and for God to be the plaything of man. After this, he speaks about how even when images are put together, they remain inanimate, they remain not alive. Now, it's pretty obvious then, based on this context, that when he, in the next few sentences after this, when he says works of art then cannot be sacred or divine, it seems most likely, very, very likely, that he is talking about idols specifically. Because for Orthodox Christians and Catholics, it's not believed that icons are literally actually Christ or the saints. There's a kind of sense in which you can speak of Christ being present in images of him, but this is not the same as an image actually being indwelt by, much less confining, the spirit of a divine being and being used as a point from which you can feed that being by means of sacrifices. That's not how we understand icons at all. And so, in context, when Clement says works of art cannot be sacred or divine, it seems like what he's saying is works of art can't be literal breathing gods that like eat the food that you give them and stuff like that. Um, in which case, it's not really saying anything about whether or not images can be holy, whether or not images can, in some sense, afford a kind of connection to the prototype. It's just saying they can't be gods. In other words, it's rejecting idolatry. In other contexts, Clement speaks of the iconic quality of, for instance, Old Testament temple furniture. And so I'm going to quote the scholar Robert Button here, and he's going to quote Clement. So Button says, in Stromatis 5:6, Clement speaks of the symbolic meaning of the golden lampstand of the temple, referred to in Exodus 25:31-40. He writes, quote, "The golden lamp conveys another enigma as the sign of Christ, not in respect of form alone, but in his casting light, at sundry times and diverse manners, on those who believe on him and hope, and who see by means of the ministry of the firstborn." Button continues, "Here the lampstand is a symbol of the cross, not only by virtue of an iconic connection between its shape and that of the cruciform, but in the additional sense of its illuminating function for the faithful." So, with this kind of a view of the holy images of the Old Testament, I think it helps to seal and clarify, no pun intended there, it helps to clarify that what Clement means when he says works of art cannot be sacred or divine isn't that works of art don't carry divine grace ever, that they never afford connection to Christ, but rather just that, again, they're not animate, they're not literally alive, you can't feed them. Similar arguments can be made about many of the quotations in Origen. So in one passage in Against Celsus, Origen says that those who, being taught in the school of Jesus Christ, have rejected all images and statues, and even all Jewish superstition, that they may look upward through the Word of God to the one God who is the Father of the Word. Now, at first, this sounds like a clear aniconic quote. This early Christian just completely rejects any kinds of images whatsoever. However, in some cases, the translation of ante-Nicene Christian works into English can be a little bit, shall we say, imprecise at best when it comes to this question of images. The word that's actually used for images in this text is a word that actually means like shrine or temple, and it's not the word icon in Greek. And this makes clear that the images in view here are not images in general. He's not saying that Christians reject all images of every kind. He's saying Christians reject shrines. It's talking about specifically pagan cultic structures used for the idolatrous worship of false gods, and therefore doesn't really have anything to say about Christian attitudes towards images more broadly. I think that these two examples are really helpful because they show that considerations of context, as well as other things an author says, can clarify what's meant by the anti-image invective, as well as there just being sometimes even problems with translation, where it looks like all images are being spoken against, when in reality it specifically is pagan cultic images. There are many contemporary scholars who have, I think, come to an acknowledgement of the fact that this is the correct way of reading ante-Nicene Christian authors generally. There may be like a couple exceptions here or there, but that the anti-image invective is something that specifically targets idolatry and related practices. This is the view of scholars such as Paul Corby Finney in his book, The Invisible God. Robin Jensen as well holds this view. It's expressed in her Icons to Idols as well as other works. And then also the Oxford art historian Joss Elsner makes a similar makes a similar claim in basically summarizing the state of the scholarship and saying that, yeah, the last generation of scholarship about this has basically kind of tossed out these ante-Nicene anti-image invective passages, has kind of gotten rid of them as making claims about all images and tends to view them basically as having this cultic significance, specifically in reference to pagan idols. And since idols and icons are not the same thing, and since we have these positive testimonies that I argue for in the book, as well as the material culture from surviving paintings and other things, it does make it it makes it pretty easy to take that view and to see this as something where the early church had a strong and forceful rejection of idolatry, but not of all images and not even of image veneration itself.
That's super helpful. And I am the furthest thing from an expert in this, but it does seem like there has been a movement in the field of early Christian art studies to move away from what might have been like a kind of 19th century consensus on, yeah, the early church was just aniconic, and then we have this changing. And it seems like some of that is in part, or maybe largely in part, of the material evidence that we've kind of discovered through archaeology to say, wait, if they've got these images, maybe we have to come back to these texts and ask, are we right in assuming that they're talking about everything here? Because it seems like, they've got images. So how do we kind of square that circle, if you will? But Michael, this has
Yeah.
been absolutely fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. I would happily talk about this all night, although it would get me in trouble seeing as this is a Friday night. And I can smell the dinner wafting from downstairs. But I want to say thanks once again for this. I'll link to your book in the description. You've mentioned once or twice in this episode that there is going to be a volume 2 and I think a volume 3 that I think Seraphim Hamilton might be involved in. Do you have any updates on that?
Yeah, I will say that uh, at this point, I'm setting my sights on at least one more volume, and in that volume two, what I would want to do is return more to the question of portraiture and the evidence for it in the pre-Nicene Church. I would want to look at testimonies from authors that are kind of uh, right there at the beginning of the fourth century, such as Eusebius, and look at enemy attestation from non-Christian sources, which are criticizing Orthodox Christians of this time and seem to be attacking them for having image veneration practices, ironically, um, uh, in the second and the third centuries. And then I'm also going to take a look at some surviving archaeological evidence related to small objects such as lamps, surviving engraved gems that we have. I'm going to look at some engravings and inscriptions, um, as well as the use of nomina sacra in the context of early Christian textual culture, where you abbreviate holy names by means of, uh, yeah, just as a way of showing honor to the person who's named. And additionally, I'm also going to be looking at the pre-Nicene attitudes towards Old Testament images. And I think it'll be particularly interesting for people to see a consistent understanding of the bronze serpent image as a prototype of the cross, as an image of Christ, and as something that was venerated, understood as being venerated by pre Nicene Christians, venerated before it became an object of worship and was destroyed by King Hezekiah rightly. So that's coming up in volume two. And I may be able to complete a bit of an examination of biblical material related to image veneration, which I do actually think there's quite a bit of, um, as well as hopefully some comments about the Second Council of Nicaea and what it does and does not say. If that has to stretch into a third book, then so be it. I'd be happy to do it, but it might be the kind of thing that could be put all into a second volume. But I'm very excited about that next step, and hope people will enjoy the first volume and the second one when it comes out.
Awesome. Well, best of luck with that. It sounds like a large project, but a worthy endeavor. Michael, thanks so much. This has been a pleasure.
Really appreciate it, Austin. Thank you for your time.